So how long does it take to get housed once you made a homeless application? This is a very fair question. I keep seeing people ask this question in various Facebook housing advice groups, and I keep seeing them getting shot down by the admins and other people who basically say, oh, you know, no one knows the answer to this, and you know, it'll take as long as it takes and so on. And basically that's not entirely true, because this data is available if you ask for it, and that's exactly what I've done. I thought I'd just try and be helpful. I've made an FOI to every single council in the country, in England that is, and I basically requested the average waiting times for homeless applicants as they go through the process. But there's loads and loads of caveats with this, so you need to watch this whole video. This isn't me trying to get my algorithm looking good or whatever. You need to watch the entire video here to really understand what these figures mean, because there is nothing worse than telling someone a bit of info and they run off and they go and use it and they misuse it and they come back and say, actually, you know, I'm worse off now because this data was wrong. So this data is as accurate as I can make it, but as I say, there are various caveats of how it's been measured and what it's picking up and what it's not picking up, and also some other regional variations and kind of local variations as to how these figures are compiled. Now, the reason I really wanted to do this was that I think it will be useful for a number of groups of people. The first are people who are fleeing domestic abuse, who want to leave their home area. Now, if you're fleeing domestic abuse or if you're affected by domestic abuse, you don't need to leave your area necessarily, but some people will want to do that. And the average waiting times of the area they approach may well be a factor in terms of which council they want to approach, because it varies massively. The stats I got back, as you'll see, the longest waiting time I could see in terms of averages was Kingston upon Thames for a 4-bed, and the average waiting time was 87 years. And the average waiting time in Bassetlaw, conversely, was only 6 days. So you can see actually that councils vary massively around the country, and therefore if you literally don't care where you go, or if you maybe have two preferences, if you find out what the average waiting times are, and I'll start displaying it on the screen shortly, you can basically factor that into the decision you make. Because if it's a case of waiting 10 years to get housed or just 1 year, it might be that you want to approach the council where there's much shorter waiting time. So that's the first group. And similarly, there are people who have got more than one local connection who are homeless. It's very easy for that to happen. It might be that you've got different family members in different districts. You might be work in one district and live in another, whatever it might be. There are situations where you might be able to approach two councils, and again, you might be surprised how much they vary even within close proximity. So I was surprised by a lot of the councils just north of London how short the waiting times actually were compared with London in particular. So it might be that actually, you know, do you approach Enfield or do you approach Dacorum Council or St Albans or something? They're actually quite close in terms of geography, but the waiting times vary hugely, as we'll see as we go through. So that's another group of people I hope helps. You might also just get people who literally have made a homeless application, and quite understandably they want to know what kind of time frame they're looking at in order to get through the process. So you know, that's not an unreasonable kind of thing to want. Again, you know, these Facebook groups can often be quite unkind to people asking that for that information, but you've got a number of things to worry about when you're homeless, and having some kind of idea of how long that's likely to be is going to help you out when it comes to things like school placements and jobs and all that sort of thing. So that's the kind of third group. And then finally, the last group I can obviously think of are professionals who help people who are homeless. Because the fact of the matter is if waiting times vary as much as they do, it may well be that it's far more effective and you have far more impact if you support people to approach councils with shorter waiting times. Now again, it's not always possible, and I'm not in any way suggesting that we should force people to go to a council they don't want to go to, but there are many people who genuinely want to move, and using this information might just help structure how you challenge the system rather than just the kind of individual cases. Because you can fight Camden Council, you can fight Westminster City Council all you want, they are not really going to be able to change. And if it's the case that you can get 5 times as many people housed in Somerset than you can in Camden, I would say there's a very strong argument there to actually kind of push resources towards the kind of leafy suburb areas. I always get frustrated by the fact that a lot of the legal aid funded services is, you know, they spend their time and resources fighting London councils, when really, you know, those legal aid deserts, those kind of more leafy suburb areas, you can have a lot more impact if you go after those councils and you basically push people towards those councils. And on that same kind of idea, those leafy suburb councils that tend to have lower waiting times, they're actually the councils that have the capacity to build more homes. Essentially, I'm assuming everyone watching the video agrees that we need to build more homes. So if you know, again, if you want to try and push Camden and Westminster into building more homes, that's very difficult for them to do because of the space and the cost and everything. If you're pushing people outside, if you're trying to help people who want to go outside London and away from the big cities, this actually might well have a long-term impact on housing stock and housing demand and how many houses are actually built. I can say a lot more about that, but I'm not going to here. So I'm going to start flashing up the data at the bottom of the screen so we can get through it. So hopefully you'll be able to see, it's in alphabetical order, you'll be able to see your council or number of councils and look at the way it works. Now, if there is data missing from the Excel sheet, from the kind of the actual entry, it's because they didn't provide data. So lots of councils don't have 5-bed properties, for example, so lots of the 5-bed column are blank. There are some councils that didn't provide the full breakdown figures, so they kind of provided an overall average. I'll explain more about that in a minute. And there are some councils that didn't bother responding at all. So again, I'll talk about that in a minute. But as we go through the councils, again, hoping it'll just be useful. I'm also going to put some other council examples up on the screen to help us understand what these figures mean. But as I say, I'm going to just kind of roam through it. I will publish this as a spreadsheet somewhere. I'm not quite sure where's best to do it. I'll probably be putting it up on our Facebook page as a pinned post, so Homelessness Best Practice CIC. I'll almost certainly be putting it in the group because you can put PDFs there as well, so Homelessness Best Practice group. And I may well end up putting it onto Will Flack's website as well, if he's assuming he's happy for me to do that, because again, there's a great resource there in terms of different bits of information. You'll also notice I've done a map about it, which again, it just kind of gives an idea of how the variations work around the country. So that's actually largely speaking for 2-bed properties. So again, I'll probably talk about that a bit again in a minute. And again, as always, I want to make some apologies for the fact I'm going to use quite a lot of jargon here. I'm going to try my best to explain things as best I can, but there is going to be some jargon I use which I may just miss and may just kind of include in the video without explaining what it means. If you've got any questions about that, just stick it in the comments and I'll try and answer it as best I can. And I guess there's a bit of a disclaimer. I've tried my utmost best to make this as accurate as possible, but there's something like 300 councils in the country, and it's possible that somewhere along the line I've made mistakes. I have tried to check it and double check it, but it's possible that some of the information will be inaccurate simply because I didn't copy it in properly to the Excel sheet. As I say, I'm hoping I minimise that, but I guess I've just got to add that caveat in. Hopefully that introduces what I'm trying to do here with these stats. I'm now going to break it down and explain a lot more about what these stats actually mean, because if you just literally read the Excel sheet and go off and try and think that that's going to be an accurate number, you may well get a kind of a nasty surprise and find out that's not actually what's happening. And so the first thing I need to explain is that there are limitations with what you can request with a Freedom of Information request, an FOI request. Now, any citizen can make an FOI request. You can do it to any public body, which includes councils, and for the most part, councils or any public body would have to answer what you're asking for, but there are some limitations with this. So for example, you can't request personal data, which is obvious. Basically, councils don't need to respond to you if it's going to take more than 18 hours to respond to your question. And that makes it very tricky for me trying to design the question, because I could have got into a lot more detail, but what I think would have almost certainly happened is far more councils would have told me that they didn't have the time to actually respond to the request. Even with the question I asked, a number of councils, maybe something like 10 councils, didn't provide the data because they said it takes too much time, and I didn't have the time to go and chase them, because in most cases, because that council would have had the building blocks of the information they need, legally they should have basically retrieved it or spent up to 18 hours retrieving it. And when you ask a council or a public body for too much information or a too complicated question, they should come back to you and say, look, we can't respond to this question because it's going to take too long, but if you refined your search, maybe you did it for a shorter time period or something like that, then we can provide it. That's what they should do voluntarily. But again, a lot of councils didn't do that. You had to kind of prompt them and say, so can you help me to refine my search? Councils have then got a 20-day limit to respond to your question once they've got all the information they need. A couple of councils did come back to me and get me to clarify it, which was fair enough. And I managed to miss out I managed to miss out all the councils that start with East when I started off. So I did this over a 3-month period. I did it between September and basically the beginning of December. There's still a couple of councils that haven't responded to me yet, even though they said they will. So I think Hartlepool's one of them. I'm not going to wait any longer for it, but they've been telling me for a while they're going to respond and they just haven't. But that kind of gives you an idea of why I asked the question I did in the way that I did, because I could have asked for more information or more data, but I think it would have just come back meaning that they wouldn't respond at all. So unfortunately it's a little bit clumsy, and there is room for different interpretations of it, but that was also partially deliberate, to be honest, because I wanted to see what they'd give me with the question I asked. So the actual wording of the question I asked was, please could you provide the average time, in days if possible, that homeless applicants owed the main homelessness duty on the housing register take to be housed for 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 bedroom properties. So the reason I asked this question in that way is that I wanted a very specific bit of information, and this is when I need to get very technical to explain how the homeless application system works in a nutshell. I have done longer videos about this on the channel where I explain, you know, whether you get private rented, whether you can turn down offers of accommodation and so on. But I'm going to give it in a very quick summary now. So let's say my house gets washed away in a flood. So I'm homeless, I'm a British national, I've got recourse to public funds, so I'm eligible. Because I'm homeless because of a flood, I'm automatically in priority needs. I'm obviously not intentionally homeless, and let's say local connection hasn't kicked in, or I approach Bedford Borough Council where I live. I know from that first instance that the council will owe me the main housing duty if only the application gets that far. But councils can end the duty early in the relief stage. Now the relief period is a section, it's a 56-day period which should start very shortly after me approaching the council, and it should only last for 56 days. I'll explain why that's significant in a minute. So if I approach the council, my house has been flooded or it's been washed away, I know there's no doubt I'm going to be owed the main duty, but the council could make what's called a final accommodation offer, which would be a 6-month assured short hold tenancy in the private rented sector, or they could give me what's called a final Part 6 offer, which would be a direct let of social housing in that relief period. And if I refused that, then they would end all duty to me. So the data for that is not included in what I've asked for, because I've only asked for data once the main housing duty has been accepted. And even when you get through the relief period and that duty ends, the council can still owe you, if they owe you the main housing duty, they can still actually discharge that duty. They can end that duty by giving me a 12-month assured short hold tenancy. So as we've said a lot on this channel, councils don't have to give you social housing just because you're homeless. There is no guarantee you're going to get social housing. In some councils, you're almost guaranteed to get private rented. And just to go back a step, just to explain what main housing duty is. The main housing duty, or it's also known as the main homelessness duty, is owed to anyone who is found to be homeless, eligible, in priority needs, not intentionally homeless, and local connections taken care of. Again, I've done a number of other videos about that in more detail, but that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the main housing duty. So as we can see, many people will approach the council and will actually get housed long before the main housing duty even kicks in. And so all of those households will not be included in these figures. So I appreciate there's some limitations already with that. And you've also got this problem that most councils, and I think understandably, interpreted my question to be talking about people getting housed in social housing. In fact, I think almost all councils took it that way, and that's kind of the way I wanted it to be taken. So Leeds, as an example, was really helpful. A number of councils were actually really helpful in terms of providing more data. But as you can see, they actually separated out the average waiting times for people who ended up in social housing versus those who were still owed the main housing duty but ended up in private rented sector. So, for example, the average waiting time for a 2-bed in social housing was 595 days, and it was only 95 days for private rented sector discharge. So again, we can kind of see this idea that what I think this data or these stats are provide an average upper limit of the amount of time you can expect to wait once the main housing duty has been accepted. But again, you're still going to have cases which far exceed that. There's a kind of question about whether, you know, mean or median is a best way to look at averages here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's kind of really what we're talking about. I was also surprised because some councils essentially said they don't house anyone at all who is homeless in social housing. So Newham in London said that. I don't think they meant quite what they said, because what they basically said was homeless applicants don't get housed in social housing in Newham. Now that would be unlawful to have a blanket approach, but what I think they probably meant was the way the housing allocation scheme, the way the banding scheme is structured, means that people who are homeless are on a low band, and although they're on the housing register, they've got no actual real prospect of getting housed, so they're all housed in private rented where there is the main housing duty. So dotting around slightly, again, just kind of looking at why I asked this question the way I did. I essentially have asked the question, what is the average waiting time once the relief duty is finished? Because when the relief duty finishes, that's when they reach a decision that you are or you're not owed the main housing duty. And this is where it's really important to understand is actually one of the few places in this process where you have a little bit of control over how long this takes. Because the Homelessness Code of Guidance basically says for those who are owed the main housing duty, the relief duty should end on day 56, and they should issue a decision on day 57, which basically accepts the main housing duty. It does then say in some exceptionally complex cases, the council's got an additional 3 weeks to provide that decision, but that should, generally speaking, really be only 56 days or 8 weeks. The problem you've got is that we hear a lot of people who've been left in relief duty for like 12 months. And in effect, what's really happening there is the clock hasn't even started ticking yet in terms of getting through, you know, the average waiting times. So Great Yarmouth was a good example here where they actually provided me with the average waiting time for those who were accepted as main homelessness duty owed through to essentially the case being closed. But they also gave me the figures for the entire process as well. Now, as I say, really the difference between those two numbers should be 56 days in almost all cases. But what we actually see is that the overall kind of time period from making an application through to the duty ending was, you know, sometimes triple what it should have been. So what's happening in Great Yarmouth is that people are making applications. The relief duty is presumably starting very early on, but then they are being left in relief duty for months and months and months before that main duty is actually accepted, and they are actually kind of given that final banding to be able to have a good chance of bidding. So if you're in the relief duty, you're pretty sure you're going to be owed the main housing duty, I would say it's very worthwhile raising it. I would personally complain to the council and say, you have a duty to provide or make this decision within 56 days. You haven't done it. It's now affecting me. And you do see local government and social care ombudsman decisions providing compensation or recommending compensation just because that relief duty has not been ended in a timely fashion. So the final thing to really kind of make sense of that is that when you make a homeless application, the trigger point of making an application is that you ask a council for help with housing and you give them reason to believe that you might be homeless. That's when the application's triggered. Very quickly, the council then needs to establish whether that they're satisfied that you are in fact homeless and you are in fact eligible for assistance. And once those two things have happened, that's when the relief duty starts. So in most cases, the relief duty should really start on the same day as the application being made, or maybe a couple of days later, but there should not be some kind of elongated period between making an application and the relief duty starting. So again, if you're in that situation when the relief duty is not even started yet, I'd be making a complaint and basically getting the council to get themselves into gear. Now, there are some other limitations to this data. I have already mentioned that I just didn't have capacity to keep chasing councils that weren't providing the figures. On the same sort of line, there's no guarantee the figures the councils actually gave me are accurate. There is an extent to which I can work out if it looks suspect or not, but in some cases I'm simply not going to know if the data is accurate at all. I'll give an example of this. Actually, it turned out to be accurate, but I got figures back from Bassett Law which said that the average waiting time was 6 days. And I went back to them and queried them and say, are you sure it's only 6 days? And the actual guy from the housing option was really helpful. He rang me up and basically said, no, really, we are able to get people housed and get the duty ended that quickly because they've got their own housing stock. And what it sounds like they're doing in Bassett Law is they're moving people into TA in their own stock, and then they're converting those temporary accommodation licenses into tenancies, which I think is a great way to work. So yeah, as I say, there are some kind of councils which I'm not quite sure about. So for example, Waverley basically said that there were no figures for 2, 3 and 4 bed homes because everyone who made a homeless application was a 1 bed need, which I just can't make sense of, to be honest, and I didn't have time to kind of take it up with all of them. So there are those figures. We kind of have to take them at face value, I guess. I think if you're going to use these figures in terms of factoring in your decision making, I think if you just treat them as ballpark figures, you're probably going to be, it's going to be much less risk of it going wrong. I would ask of you, if you find this stuff interesting, or if you're going to find this data useful, that you do share it. So if you're in one of those housing advice Facebook groups and you see someone asking this question, do just share this video and that thing, because as I say, otherwise people get shot down and probably feel like they've asked a stupid question when really it's not a stupid question at all. So do kind of put this stuff out there, and again, if you find it useful, do like the video, because it makes a difference in terms of how many people are going to see it. And I think actually this data is really important. Some councils publish it already, and that's really helpful, and I'll give some examples of that soon as well. But some councils really don't even record it. So again, it's something that councils should know. They should be recording their own waiting times, because it makes a difference to their constituents and their residents. In terms of a few more bits about the actual statistics, I've mentioned this idea of mean and median. Now, average is a bit of a clumsy term within statistics, but most people would take that to mean the mean. So essentially, you add up the total number of days on the housing register, and then you divide it by the number of households in each bedroom type. That would be the mean. A better measure might have been a median. So median is essentially the midpoint of all the different households on the register. To give an example of the difference, the mean wage, or the mean income in England, is something like 37k, but the median is 34.5k, something like that. And the reason the mean is higher than the median is you've got all these billionaires that, you only got a few of them, but they kind of drag the average up. Whereas a median might be a better kind of idea of what kind of figure you can expect to wait. And actually, Southend City Council voluntarily provided the median as well as the mean. So again, if you look at it there, you'll notice that the median is always a little bit less than the mean, because again, you're going to have those households which have particularly unusually complex circumstances which end up staying on the housing register for years, and they kind of drag that mean up. But that's just a little point which I thought was interesting. Again, you've got the idea of range. So again, what is clear is that the range of people waiting to get housed on the housing register can vary massively. So although the average might be 1 year, you're going to have some people housed after a couple of weeks and some people housed after a few years. And Rother Valley was one example of a council which provided this data. So if we look here, you've got the number of households in each bedroom size, which was helpful. So you'll notice there that you've got 26 2-bed flat or maisonette. Whereas you've only got 3 general needs studio, but you've got the shortest wait and the longest wait. So for example, for a 1-bed general needs property, there were 16 allocations of that type of housing in the time period, which I think was about a year running up to the FOI request. The shortest of which was 3 weeks and the longest of which was 22 months, and the average was 10 months. So that's just a good example of just seeing how much it varies. But again, there are things you can do to potentially speed that up. So for example, making sure you're actually up and running and bidding and everything like that is going to make a difference there, and making reasonable bids, so not waiting until you have like the perfect property crop up, but just kind of settling for what's going to be adequate. You've also got this idea of statistical significance within these figures. So statistical significance is essentially how robust these averages are. And if we look at Camden's as a good example of this, they only had 2 properties allocated for bed sits, and the average was 639 days, but it's an average only based on 2 people, so it's far less reliable than let's say Hammersmith, who had, as we just look here as an example, 339 households in the 1-bed category. So again, the Hammersmith figure is going to be far more robust and useful and reliable than the Camden one will be. So just bearing in mind, I didn't get those kind of breakdowns for every council, only a few of the helpful councils actually provided it, but you're going to see that kind of idea that some of the figures that are out there in these stats will be based on either 1 or 2 or 3 households, and therefore are going to be far less useful as an average, and we simply don't know which ones those are to rely on them. You've also got the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't request data for older people's accommodation, which is a bit of an oversight to say the least. If I was going to do this again, I'd definitely do that and actually get the averages for older people's accommodation. Bristol provided these figures voluntarily, and as we can see, and bearing in mind in Bristol, if you're homeless, you're dealt with under Band 2 in the housing register, and it says on their kind of in the small print that older people accommodation is basically includes anyone over the age of 40 in Bristol. I would imagine most of it's going to apply to people over 55 or 60, but that's what the small print said. And you can basically see here that the averages for people who are going into older people accommodation, so sheltered accommodation and so on, is basically half of what it would be for the general needs accommodation. So I would imagine that that's going to be kind of seen across the country, where the average waiting times for older people is going to be a lot less than for people who are just in the general needs accommodation. So bear that in mind as well. You've also got the local context, which can have a bearing on it. So Oxford Council, for example, in their 4-bed average waiting time, they said it was only 130. And they basically said the reason it was so low at the moment was because a whole bunch of 4-bed properties had been built, and so that kind of meant that a lot of the people waiting to get 4-bed properties had moved in. But you would assume that that figure would then bounce back up again once those properties are filled. So you are going to have these things which simply aren't, generally speaking, included in the stats, that will have a bearing on these average waiting times, which we just can't pick up in these kind of spreadsheets. Now, one of my favourite examples was basically a bunch of councils in East Anglia, and basically when I made the FOI, they simply pointed me towards a website, and basically there's about 9 councils, so Bayberg, Braintree, Colchester, East Suffolk North, East Suffolk South, Ipswich, Malden and Mid Suffolk, and they'd obviously joined forces and had this kind of shared system. And actually you can go on that and dig around in a lot of detail to see the kind of average waiting times and the typical waiting times for people to get housed. So you can actually select, data from the last year. Let's look at Braintree's as an example. And you basically get the raw data on the number of, or the individual applicants who were housed. So you've got the sub-district that they were housed in. I assume that these are addresses like Birdbrook, Steeple, Bumpstead. I assume places within the area. And then you've got the number of weeks they had to wait to get housed. So I basically used this data to then compile to draw out the actual average waiting times I've then used in the spreadsheet. So as I say, I've seen a lot of local authority officers kind of get their nose out of joint when someone asks for the average waiting times. But this is data which should be in the public domain. It is useful data. And there is no reason why councils can't do it. A lot of councils do this voluntarily. So of those councils that didn't respond or didn't provide data, I would be going back to them and saying, why are you not why you're not recording the average waiting times for people in essentially often in temporary accommodation, it has a direct relation on how those services are delivered and how the council can save money. If you're a local authority officer and resent being asked these kind of questions, I think you're in the wrong job. I think you need to be far more helpful and far more forward thinking in terms of providing this information so people can have better understanding of the expectations they're going to have as they go through this process, because it is totally fair to say to someone or ask the question, how long is this going to take? Now, you may not always know the actual answer to that, but it's certainly not a rude question or an unreasonable question, and if we can provide the information we do have, that is going to basically give them a bit more certainty as to how long it's all going to take for them. So to conclude, I hope this data is useful, but I would definitely treat it with more than a pinch of salt because of the number of limitations, because of the number of variables that we simply can't factor in. But I would say that they are probably useful as ballpark figures. So if you are in a situation where it doesn't matter to you whether you apply to Bedford Borough Council or Central Bedfordshire Council, you can look at the average waiting times and you can see clearly that there is a significant lower waiting time in Central Bedford than there is in Bedford, and therefore you might want to consider that, and that might kind of tip you over to approaching Central Beds rather than Bedford if, assuming local connections taken care of. So that's the kind of way I think this data can be used. And as I say, I think it's useful for the homelessness sector, charity sector and the legal sector to start looking at how we deal with all this differently, because you can effectively have much more impact if you are helping people approach councils where they have lower waiting times. Now obviously there's a lot of reasons why that might be problematic. I'm not saying that we should be pushing anyone to a different council that they don't want to go to, but there will be legitimate situations where someone wants to move to a different area and the law allows them to do so. We would be sensible, I think, to kind of look at this data and actually say, okay, we're going to funnel resources, we're going to focus on councils where they have much lower waiting times, because the person gets a much better experience of the system as it is. You might be able to essentially kind of take some people from London who genuinely don't care where they are or they want to move out of London. In some cases they will be able to apply to other councils, and effectively you relieve some of the pressure in London and you put some of the pressure onto these sort of leafy suburb areas, because it's the leafy suburb districts which have the land and potentially a bit more resources to actually look at building more homes. Whereas if you go and argue with Westminster City Council all your life, yes, you get paid, but you don't change anything, and you'll just simply have this kind of constant stream of people needing homelessness support. The final thing I say is that as well as looking at these figures, you absolutely want to be looking at the local housing allocation policy, because it will set out which band you get, how, other details that you need to know, and you kind of help you understand what to expect as you go through the process. And they're all publicly available, they have to be. So I'd say those are the kind of key things you want to do if you're making a decision as to which council to approach. I think this data will be helpful, but also getting your head around the housing allocation scheme is going to make a difference as well. And kind of potentially talking to local charities who are competent and know what they're doing, that might also give you an indication of how these things will work. So yeah, I'm hoping this is helpful. As I say, please do share it widely if you can, or if you know someone asking these kind of questions, do put it their way, because I think genuinely it is good to know this stuff. Even with its limitations, it is still genuinely helpful data. I think it potentially can make a big difference in a lot of people's lives without really any extra work really. It's just a case of just understanding what the process entails, how long it's going to take, might will have a kind of a positive impact on their situation. As always, if you've got questions about this, and I expect there will be quite a few, do put them in the comments anonymously. So ask it as what if questions. Don't say I'm in this situation and what happens when I'm going to be in temporary accommodation. Just say what if someone was in this situation, what would happen. You will get the same answer, but you don't have to put your personal data onto the internet to get that answer. So yeah, every Thursday evening 7:30 p.m. we'll answer those questions. You don't need to watch it live, you can watch the recording, it's on the channel, and I'll kind of index the questions as we go through, so you should be able to find the question that you've asked without having to watch all of it. And if you're a professional and you want to understand how the law works and how you can get people housed using this framework that we're talking about here, do check out our online training and our in-person training as well if you want to get your team onto it. We run it every month, and basically if you go to Eventbrite, look at our page, you can see how to sign up, you can see what we cover. It is really well received. We've had about 100 reviews on Trustpilot, 97 of which were 5-star, 3 of which were 4-star. People leave the training buzzing, genuinely, and it is exactly the sort of stuff you need to know to get people housed. So it forgets all the boring stuff, all the stuff you don't need to know. It just focuses on how do you get people who are homeless the assistance they should be getting from their council, and potentially lead to those kind of systemic changes which I think we need to actually end homelessness.